Sergo, if you like what we're doing here, if you support the show and you want to give support to the show, you can do so by going to patreon.com/Let's Talk Native. And if you do so, we'll provide you some exclusive content and some things that others aren't going to get when you get it. So support us by going to Patreon. Yahweh.
Let's Talk Native is produced at the LTN Studios on the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. We break all the rules for Native media by peeling back the layers of assimilation and indoctrination. We may step on a few toes through our examination of culture, art, politics, history, and identity. But the real goal here is to bring our people together by breaking down what separates us. So, welcome to Let's Talk Native with John Kane.
So everyone, welcome to Let's Talk Native. I'm John Kane, I'm your host. And I gotta ask the question, are our territories still the bastions of culture and history that we wish them to be? And I ask the question because we know that, look, we've seen announcements, from places like the Choctaw of Oklahoma that declare that their nation is a Christian nation. And there's been so much imposed culture and systems, government systems, everything from the Indian Reorganization Act to even the ones who are non-IRA governments that are elected councils and that kind of. There's so much that's different now than what our history suggests, has been. So I guess I asked the question: are our territories now contributing to assimilation? And I think clearly they are. The question is, how do we push back a little bit without seeming to, necessarily to be always the contrarian in every one of our communities? I mean, we know that there are people in our communities that still, we give them names like wisdom keepers and elders, and they have a lot of information associated, cultural information. They may have a unique insight to history because of their age and that kind of stuff. But as we look though, even the most senior of our people in our territories, their childhood or childhoods they experienced their childhood during the midst of very tumultuous times. There's nobody alive today that we can go to ask how it was before colonization, for instance. And even though our territories are somewhat remote and they've been isolated from some of the effects of the outside, they were never completely isolated. I mean, so when I hear stories about how Native territories didn't experience the Depression the same way that non-Native territories did, because we didn't bank and we didn't have some of the infrastructure that was tied to their economies. We certainly know that we're already being inundated with things like churches, military actions on our territories, enlistment. But even when I think about the residential schools, we look at the residential schools today as this thing that was imposed upon us and that our children were taken away. But there was a certain amount of complicity on the side of the Native governments and what was happening socially on our territories. The churches were certainly part of it. Look, the Thomas Indian School here in the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation didn't exist in a vacuum. The Code of Handsome Lake was probably really being asserted in territory. So the longhouses were a factor with their newfound religion. The churches were being built in every one of the regions of Cattaraugus. The Seneca Nation had thrown out the so-called chief system, which I would really suggest should have been the clan system, and and adopted a written constitution, albeit kind of slim, adopted a written constitution, elected their counselors and their president. And yet the Thomas Indian School was developed during this era, during this period of time, and would exist for a significant period of time. We have plenty of people we can go to within a community who were familiar with the residential school era. Not a whole lot of people that we can talk to who predate some of that. So while we can learn about relatively recent history from some of our elders, I'm not sure that we can get a solid grasp of what it was like for this community to operate as a longhouse community, for instance. So when we talk about things like Guyana or Goa, how many places can we say, well, this is where it still exists and a community operates that way from a Haudenosaunee standpoint? Or, and frankly, many of the native territories, there aren't a whole lot that operate as traditional governments or govern themselves through a traditional process. I'm not saying none exist, but there's not a whole lot of them. So even as I'm talking about native identity, and I talk about having a connection to your people and to your culture and language and all that stuff, and oftentimes if I'm talking about the difference between someone who lives on territory and off territory, I don't think we can make that clear distinction that just because you live on territory that you have a great connection culturally. You may have a great connection with people, your people, and your territory, the land. So we get down to the question: if you leave your territory, are you leaving because you're trying to abandon that, or because I've talked about the fact that there seems to be very little hope or prospect for the future. There's no careers to be found in many native territories. So if you leave your territory and you go to the city, are you really losing that cultural connection? I'm not so sure that that's true. I mean, and I'm not encouraging people to leave our territories. I mean, so I don't want it to be interpreted that way. But I've had it explained to me that sometimes leaving was the only way to avoid the pressures of assimilation that come from within our own territories, the churches, the law enforcement. I mean, look at the battles that we have. Who has criminal jurisdiction on our territories? There's almost no place, and I say almost because there are a few, but there's almost no place where we don't allow the states, not just the federal government, but the states to assert their criminal jurisdiction on our territories. So, I mean, certainly sovereignty and the distinction of our, of our being, our autonomy isn't demonstrated there. I mean, I just saw something posted just the other day from the Seneca Nation Media Department that, a clear statement that just because New York State just legalized marijuana doesn't mean that it's legal here. Really? So why was it illegal in the first place? Because of the state? So there ends up being these strange, relationships with, what are we considered, legal or illegal, and who enforces that law? The Seneca Nation has has certain laws on their books, laws. Well, who is the law enforcement agency? The marshals? They can't rely on the outside to enforce Seneca law if the Seneca law is different than the outside law. In fact, the state police can't enforce anything, or the county police can't enforce anything other than state law. So we live in a peculiar time and place because of what exists today on our territories as far as autonomy and distinction from the outside. It's a real fuzzy line. And when I again to talk, not only just to pick on the Choctaw necessarily, but there are many native territories where church is a predominant part of their of their culture. Look, even my friends in Hawaii who are fighting to assert the Hawaiian kingdom, many of them have been very Christianized. Not all, but many. And that becomes a challenge. even as we're trying to draw a line in the sand about pushing back on the state and the federal government. Because the idea of patriotism towards the United States is sometimes deeply connected to, the religious beliefs, the education systems that have been, brought into our territories. I mean, or the fact that our kids have been brought off our territories to be educated. Look, if your kids are brought up in public school, unless you're there to push back on some of the narratives they're being taught, even as it relates to Native history, which very little of it's taught. But even when we have a Native program in our schools, there's parts of that get twisted up. So what when we teach about Native spirituality, what are we really teaching? Are we teaching a narrow view that is held by a few? Or are we really talking about culture? And are we really talking about history? And if we're going to talk about history, how do we explain how we went from a place where there was no churches on our territories, where our system of governance had no hierarchy, there was no elections, there was none of that stuff. It was done through the clans. And how did we get from there? And it's not enough to just say one day they had a referendum and they did away with the chief system. There's something that broke down before that. But we don't teach that history. So where do you learn this history? Well, look, in places like here, the Seneca Nation, they have a cultural center. So you can go down there and probably learn a lot of history and maybe get some answers to some questions. But that's a really limited institution. And that institution is almost like it's like a museum. So it's almost touristy in many ways. And I'm not condemning it. So how do we take even some of the information that they have there in their archives and in their cultural center and bring it to our kids on a regular basis, so they do know what happened during the removal period as it related to Seneca Nation or any of our other nations? So we do understand the relationship that existed between the Senecas and the Americans and the British and all of that stuff. The relationship between the Senecas and the Mohawks, the Eastern and the Western Doors of the Haudenosaunee. There's a lot of that's not understood. And again, when I talk about the activist community that exists in Native territory, sometimes it's hard to be an activist if you live within a community, because you might be condemned by the church folks in a given area, or some people who have a different view of what traditionalism is or culture is. I mean, as you know, I'm Mohawk. I live on Seneca territory, and I know there's certain animosity that some people on this community have towards the warrior flag. As I tilt my head and point to my cap, and obviously, I embrace the idea of I embrace that as a responsibility, not as the warriors or some ruthless gang that's been outlawed by the Confederacy, which isn't even true. But that's the way it's. I mean, I have a friend of mine who was the director of the American Indian Community House in New York City. And really looking out, in New York City's probably got one of the largest urban populations or Native populations in any city in the United States. There's probably, at any given time, there's probably at least 100,000 Native people who live in New York City. That's more people than live here in Seneca territory, mind you, significantly more. So that's now that 100,000 people are all different Native people, indigenous people from different places. So, but there's only one in the center, and that's the American Indian Community House. She got let go. She got fired, essentially, because she posted something declaring victory in a lawsuit about a prison, a fight over a prison in Manhattan, I think it was. And she posted the warrior flag, and this was, a bunch of the women who were fighting this, and she posted this as a warrior women. Some of the people who have an animosity towards Native or towards the quote unquote warrior society did everything in their power, and they got her fired. So these are the tensions that come back from our native territory. There was nobody in New York City, a displaced native person who was going to condemn that. But it comes from Onondaga. It might come from, from someplace else that's going to condemn this thing. So again, I go back and I ask the question, are there pressures that come from our territory to conform, not culturally, but conform to an agenda that has been very modernized, that has been very assimilated? We have conversations about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And some people want to really praise that. And while I cite it fairly often, I also am very clear that it's far from a panacea for native issues. And in fact, most people don't take the time to actually read the thing. And it says very clearly in one of the articles that it is the minimum standard. It doesn't satisfy the concerns, all of the concerns that Native people have in terms of how the nation states around us interact with us. In fact, there's a big battle going on in Canada today because Canada is trying to adopt a Canadian declaration on the rights of Indigenous people, which is very much a watered down version of what the United Nations one is. It talks about consultation as opposed to free, prior, and informed consent on a host of issues that impact Native people. So we have these debates that sometimes are being led by leadership from Native territories, even as some of us oppose it. And it's sometimes hard to find the like-minded people within a specific community. So when I see some Native people go to a city environment, they may be able to pursue a role in activism and like-minded people in that urban environment better than they could from back home, because their own families have already been indoctrinated, with religion and with American patriotism. I mean, look, this ties into much of the debate about Native people running for offices in the state, at the state level or the federal level. And look, I know that if you were to poll Native people, you would get a lot of positive responses from Native people, whether it was in an urban environment or whether it's on Native territory, about somebody like Deb Haaland getting appointed to be the Interior Secretary. You will get some pushback from folks like me who will say, well, she works for them now. But see, this is all part of this whole idea of where we sit with relationship to the history. And that history is not pretty, folks, but we don't teach it. We don't teach it as community members. It's certainly not being taught in the public schools that are outside our territories. So when do we finally come to grips with what took place? What did happen? The truth of residential schools, the truth of land loss, the truth of language loss. Look, I hear people praise, the Navajo code talkers, the Native code talkers. And it wasn't just Navajo, it was Mohawk, it was Choctaw, it was a bunch of different languages. And we praise those individuals when in the reality is those individuals were being used for a language that the United States was trying to destroy. Kill the Indian, save the man. That was the policy at these residential schools. Among the things that they were trying to kill about Native people was our language, until they figured they could use it, they could weaponize it. And so we praise many of those people who are very old now because it was World War II. There's only a few code talkers left. But we don't tell the truth. We don't tell the real story behind what was happening to our language and how it came to be, and how it came to be used militarily. Oh, look, I see our people say, well, our Native code talkers won the war. Well, no, they didn't. But see, that's the way we're taught. And we're taught that so we can be proud of them. Not necessarily proud of the language. Because in this situation, Our language was being exploited by what has now become the U.S. military-industrial complex. And so it wasn't this great triumph of native culture, because there was no big effort to sink a bunch of money and resources into and reparations back to Native people for having that language stripped away for decades. Almost a full century of destroying our language. See, that's where I got to ask the question. Because in this moment, in our territories, is there a greater pressure to assimilate? I mean, generally, assimilate Native people to the American system? I mean, look, for the most part, if you look at how governance works on Native territory, and this is on the U.S. and the Canadian side, this idea of municipalizing Native government. So these are like governments. I mean, I heard some hired consultant by the Seneca Nation describe the Seneca Nation as part of the system of federalism, as if the Seneca Nation government fit in there somewhere between township governments of townships and counties and state. It was somewhere in between there. Like there was this governing system that the Seneca Nation government fit within the system of federal, state, local government, rather than something separate and different and distinct and autonomous. And that's problematic, because if the Seneca Nation or any other Native government is just a municipal government, so our territories are just these little municipalities within a state, then how did that happen? So it doesn't just become a bit of a cultural question. It goes back to being a bit of a historical question. So again, let me remind people, there's no question that our connection to people and place is important. And I'm not by any means suggesting that there's not value to our native territories. There's a tremendous amount of value. And I'm not suggesting there's not tremendous value to our language. There's a tremendous amount of value. Because that combination of place and language, if those things are looked at more thoroughly, we find that there's a lot of history. You know, my friend Ed Schindler he asked the question, what were they thinking? He used to teach a class. And so his question was, what were our ancestors thinking? The only insight we have to those people who are no longer with us to talk to is the language, because it was our ancestors that developed the language. Our language didn't come from the Creator. Sorry, if that's your belief system, I challenge that. Our language was developed by our people, the people who came before us. And if we understand the etymology of our words, we know what they were thinking. So when we talk about things like rain, and we say it, and we understand that yogonoro, which means we know it's precious. We know how our people viewed the rain. We know by the words that they use and breaking down those words, we knew what they were thinking when they described a concept. Our languages are not necessarily noun-based. They're descriptive. So they describe an action or some other metaphoric description. So we understand by their use of metaphor, by their use of their description of an object, I guess, how they viewed that object, whether they viewed it positively or negatively, whether they viewed it as, how they viewed that these things, these labels that they created, on how we interacted with them. So we know what they were thinking. But if we don't teach it in that way, and if we don't delve into the real history, and look, I'm not talking about 7 generations ago, which would be great if we could grab onto some of that. But if we're only talking about 100 years ago or 150 years ago, that's not a long time. Look, we as a people, we have existed for thousands of years, with a continuity to our language and to our culture, to where we lived. But it's only been in the last 150 years that has been disrupted. And if we're going to ignore everything before that, or everything even that's transpired in the last 150 years, and we're going to speak romantically about what we were, but not how we transition to who we are, then we can't connect ourselves today to our ancestors. We've broken that chain. And part of that chain was broken most significantly because of colonization, because of residential schools, because of war, because of of poverty. But we have to revisit that. I've mentioned I've been watching this series on HBO called "Exterminate All the Brutes." It's fascinating, but I'll tell you, when you watch this thing, it has to stir up emotions, because much of the stuff that they're talking about and the comparisons they're making to what has existed throughout the world and throughout time, there was nothing so unique about what the Jews experienced at the hands of the Nazis. I'm not saying that it wasn't horrendous, but it matches up what transpired with Native people, with other immigrant populations, with other ethnic cleansing events that have taken place throughout the world. And so why do they repeat themselves? Because we don't learn from them. We bury it. Just like the mass graves, we bury it. So, look, when I asked the question originally, are our territories the bastions of culture and history? No, they probably aren't. But they could be, and they should be. But we have to make a concerted effort to connect the dots, to connect ourselves from where we are today to before colonization, and tell that story about how we go from there to here, from then to now. Because in order for our culture to continue, and I don't mean just some semblance, some hints of our culture, but for us to maintain any cultural integrity and distinction, we have to know the history. And we have to be proud of the fact that in spite of all the adversity, that we've been able to maintain pieces of it. Look, did we lose some along the way? Yeah, absolutely. We lost people. We lost stories. We lost songs. We lost all kinds of things along the way. But we've also seen some of those songs come back, almost from the dead, right? We've heard, that song sounds familiar. I think I heard that song before someplace. So we look at each one of our native territories, from Oswego to Ganawage to Wahta to, and even as we interact with some of our other relatives, that are not necessarily recognized as Haudenosaunee, we find that we had some cultural exchanges. So some of those songs come back. One of the things, and I lament this tremendously, one of the things that was eliminated so significantly during the residential school period, was this idea of a whether we want to break it down to a specific ceremony, but this whole idea of a rite of passage, how our children went from being children to adults, that was stripped away. And not every child went to residential schools, but the whole idea of this imposition of the outside education and what our kids were being educated to and for, and to become what they were to become with that education, changes everything. There is an effort now to bring some of that back. But whether we bring back a specific ceremony or just the notion that how do we prepare our kids culturally, both our boys and our girls, to become men and women? Yeah, and of course that there is a connection to what we prepare them for and what we do for a livelihood. So I know as I address Native people who no longer live on territory, and I know the struggle that must exist for them to maintain cultural connections. Human connections are easier to do, but cultural connections are tough because so much of the culture has been lost in our territories. And so much of the advocacy and the activism is tough. I mean, look, American Indian movement was born out of Native people in the cities. Some of the warrior society issues may have been born on territory, but I think there has to be a connection. So I asked the question not because I'm really looking for the answer to the question, but really an answer to the problem that exists because we don't necessarily have the strong will to teach culture and history in our territories, not in a broad-based way. And we can't expect it to be done in public schools. So that's my topic for today. I thank you for indulging me. And again, let's have the conversation. I'm John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. Yahweh.